Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are joining us. My name is Rosalie Olmsted. I am WESA's Executive Assistant. It is my honor to have you all here today with WESA's strategic partner, Sandia National Laboratories. But before we get started, I would like to give a quick overview of the WESA's organization. We often go by our acronym, WESIS, because that is exactly what we are, a global cyber sisterhood. WESIS is a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission to recruit, retain, and advance women in cybersecurity. Our community is made up of over 10,000 members in over 90 countries. We have 70 professional affiliates and 270 student chapters around the world. We offer a variety of programs and initiatives throughout the year, including our security training scholarship, our annual conference, leadership series, Job Board Plus Plus, and many more. We owe all of our wonderful initiatives to all of our strategic partners who fund us year round. Our tier one partners being Akamai, Amazon, Bloomberg, Carnegie Mellon University Software Engineering Institute, Cisco, Ford, Google, Lockheed Martin, Microsoft, Optum, Sandia National Laboratories, and SentinelOne. Please do not forget to ask questions throughout the webinar. If you have any, to drop them in the questions box at the bottom of your screen. And if time permits, we will get to them during the Q&A's portion of the session. And lastly, if you haven't done so already, be sure to subscribe to the WESIS newsletter and stay up to date on our upcoming WESIS events, programs, and webinars. You can find it at wesis.org in the upper right-hand corner. And with that, I will turn it over to Ruchi with Sandia National Laboratories.
All right, let me make sure I got the right screen going. All right, perfect. So, hi everybody. My name is Ruchi Banerjee. I work at Sandia along with our amazing panelists here today, Susanna Gordon, Denise Grayson, and Courtney Thomas. And today we'll be talking about elevating women in cybersecurity. So, specifically addressing the gender pay gap, the leadership challenges for women in cyber, and the importance of mentorship. So, a brief background about me. I have an education in computer science and cybersecurity. I was an intern for Sandia for a year before I converted full time. And since then, I've been working on their incident response team for just over 2.5 years. And I do also have additional work that I do in cloud security and purple teaming. All right, let's dive into our amazing panelists. If each of you could briefly tell us about your journey through cybersecurity and how you ended up where you are today. Let's start with Susanna.
Great. Hi. So I'm Susanna Gordon. I'm a senior manager at Sandia National Labs in Livermore, California. And my journey, I'd say, is more to cybersecurity than through cybersecurity. I actually went to Cornell as an applied physics undergraduate and then came out to California to Berkeley to study physics some more, to have a PhD, and came to work at Sandia as a system analyst, basically someone looking at a lot of different types of problems in national security. And during that time, I started to learn a little bit about cybersecurity, not as an expert in cyber, but as someone who thinks about, cyber is a very large problem space. It's a really hard problem. How do you defend networks? How to defend systems? It's hard to know where to start sometimes. So I actually started in this as an analyst, thinking about how do you prioritize your limited resources and things like that. And as I became a manager at Sandia, I ended up managing teams of cyber experts, including our enterprise security team at one time, and right now with a team of people who are looking at cybersecurity of embedded systems. And so I've managed cyber teams for about 10 years in various ways, and just really impressed by those teams. And some of the folks are here who have joined them. Thanks.
Thanks, Susanna. All right, Denise, go ahead.
Sure. For me, my current role, right, is I'm the incident response team lead at Sandia, and pretty much my whole career has been in cybersecurity. It started for me when I was a senior in high school and trying to figure out where I wanted to go to school and what I wanted to study exactly. And one of my interests was in kind of criminal justice investigative. I like the idea of finding different pieces of evidence and solving the problem. And on one of my school visits, they were like, "Hey, we have a cybersecurity program with digital forensics and doing a lot of that investigative type thing, but just on a computer network level." And so that was the route that I went. And then I started my career with the Department of Defense doing. I was on a team that did both some security testing and incident response and digital forensics work. And then at one point, as we grew, we split, and I chose to go the incident response and forensics route, and that has brought me to where I am today.
Thanks, Denise. And Courtney, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney. I'm a digital systems security engineer here. And I would say I actually have a fairly unconventional path into cyber. I did my undergrad in poli sci, and I actually initially went to grad school for public policy. It wasn't until my first semester that I actually learned about cyber and ended up switching into their information security policy and management program. I interned as a security engineer that summer, and I actually met a Sandia recruiter at Carnegie Mellon's career fair. And I was in the process of interviewing for another role at Sandia when I actually met my now current manager at a WESIS conference in Denver. And he ended up telling me about an opening on his team. I applied, interviewed, and the rest is history.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Courtney. All right, moving on to our main topics. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the current state of inclusion for women in cybersecurity. So WESIS actually partnered with Alaria, so it's a organization dedicated to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they were able to provide the first ever assessment that reported extensive inclusion data across an entire industry sector. So, in this case, cybersecurity. And their goal was to get organizations thinking about the impact of DEI on their employees. And here are their key findings. They discovered that women in cyber are excluded at a rate 2 times higher than men. And if of that, top 4 categories are respect, recognition, career and growth opportunities, and access and participation. The way that they calculated these exclusion index was based on 3 things. So the first being prevalence, meaning the proportion of participants who shared at least one experience of exclusion; severity, which was the average number of experiences shared per person; and then frequency. So, was this a one time thing or a recurring issue? And what I really want you to notice on the chart on the right is how large that exclusion number is for respect compared to any of the other categories. And normally in tech fields, you kind of expect it, it's a common thing, but what's really unusual is the sharp difference in the exclusion index between respect and any other category in that list. So it really confirms that respect is a big issue in cybersecurity itself. And why is this exclusion happening? So, of the women in this study, they cited peers, direct managers, and leadership as sources that interfere with their job satisfaction and their ability to perform at their peak. And if you look at just the women, 58% are saying that it's leadership, that's their biggest source. And it's closely followed by 50% saying direct managers and 39% saying their peers. And if you look at this table on the left for women, look at that cross section between respect and leadership. It's 78 is the score in there. That's the highest of any of the other categories. So we really need to focus on these sources and understand how to improve on that front. And why does inclusion matter, right? We're talking about, increased diversity, happier employees. But take this case study as an example. There's a company generating $1 billion in revenue. There's 4,000 employees, of which 25% identify as women, 10% as people of color. And using that average exclusion score, Illyria has able has been able to estimate that that company is losing roughly $12 million per year from productivity losses and another 11 million from unwanted attrition. So that's a total of $23 million simply because women and people of color are being treated differently than white men. So Denise and Courtney, I had a question for you. Have either of you ever experienced biases towards you for being a woman in cyber? Have you felt constricted in your career growth opportunities, maybe? And if so, did you do anything to open more doorways for yourself and how? Let's start with Denise.
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's lots of different situations as you look back across your career. But I'll be honest, when I saw this question, I thought of a couple things that were actually positive examples that I wanted to share that I think kind of help talk about career growth and opening doors for yourself as well. Um, One of those is, my direct boss has been a man my entire career in my different roles. But in a lot of my time, including very early in my career, my boss's boss was a woman, and I saw, women in other leadership positions. And so I do think that that is a key part. I know we're going to talk some about mentoring later, right? But being able to see the kind of some of the possibilities for your career, I think is always a promising thing. And watching some of those women, and especially one of them was someone that often filled in for kind of one of our field office leaders, and kind of took a lot of briefings in his place, and she was always extremely prepared and knew, I don't think there was a lot that happened that she wasn't aware of, and she read anything that crossed her desk, she read very thoroughly, and that was very impressive to me. And so I think those examples are something that are an important part of your career growth to look for those things. And another element that I wanted to mention was when I was in college and doing like some scholarship applications and things like that. I mentioned that I kind of didn't really get into computer science, computer security until I went to college. And one of the things that one of my professors talked to me about was like there's a lot of people, if you look around in your classes, that maybe have different backgrounds, different ways that they focus their education or hobbies. There were a lot of people that were better programmers than me, or that had more computer experience than I did, because that wasn't as much of a focus for me in high school. And there weren't a lot of women, and so kind of taking all those things in totality, he was like, okay, there's some of the things that I did, maybe that was sports, maybe that was student government, that maybe were things that were different than my peers, and to try to kind of highlight those, right, and leverage your differences to kind of say, hey, here's a different perspective, a different experience that I have than my peers. And so while that message wasn't specifically just about being a woman, I took that as a very positive message, right, as whatever 20-year-old sophomore in college, to say, it's easy sometimes to look around and see your differences, and sometimes we think of those that can be a negative thing, and sometimes they can be when there are some of these situations where there are biases. But also, how can you look at it yourself and as ways that allow you to bring something new and different to the group, and try to highlight that.
Awesome. Thank you, Denise. And Courtney, what about you?
Um, as much as I would love to say that I hadn't experienced any biases towards being a woman in cyber, I would be lying. However, one thing I did notice is that most of my experience actually came from when I was just starting to get into cyber and when I was in school, and much less now that I'm actually in the workforce. Now, I do want to give like a little disclosure. My professors were nothing but supportive. I remember there was one class where I was the only woman in the class, and my professor went above and beyond. He wanted to make sure I felt comfortable and even asked if I knew about WESIS. And I don't think my peers were acting maliciously. However, I think sometimes when your casual environment, such as like when you're in school or you're like amongst your friends, you're more likely to say something that you normally wouldn't in a professional environment like work. However, that still doesn't mean that it doesn't hurt the person that I was directed to. So I remember three experiences specifically where I've experienced some form of bias. The first was actually before I even entered cyber. So I still remember this day clear as day, or I still remember this clear as day. It was the day I actually was introduced into the idea that I could switch programs. So I had a couple friends over. Taylor Swift had just dropped her Red Taylor's version, and I threw like a little listening party. And I was talking to some of my friends and let them know that I was thinking about switching. And one of them, who was not in cyber, looked me in my face and said, "They're only telling you that you can switch to increase their diversity in that program." And that was not the last time I was told I was there to increase diversity. Um, the second kind of ties into the first one, and that was being told I was the diversity hire. I've had some of my closest friends, both men and women alike, tell me that I either got my internship or I got my job because of that. Um, we were required to do a summer internship between the first and second year of my master's program. And I ended up getting an offer to be a security engineer at a very, very large US company. And when I got my offer, I was very new into cyber. I'm talking like I had started the program in January and I got this offer mid March. And I think that upset some of my peers who were still searching for internships and had years of experience more than I did. However, although I like to think that they didn't mean it and they were just expressing their frustrations, I still took it incredibly personal. And it's something that to this day, I still feel like I have to continuously prove myself that I got this job or I got these job offers based on my qualifications and based on my skill set and not because they needed to meet a certain quota. Um, the third was when I was actually interviewing for internships. It was my first ever time interviewing for an internship in cyber. And the first words out of the hiring manager's mouth were, "I'm glad I saw you first. I assumed you were going to be a guy." That actually took me very by surprise. One, because the hiring manager was a woman, but also prior to this, I had no one, let alone like during an interview, ever mention my gender. Um, I laughed it off, told her it happens all the time. It doesn't. But now that I've fully entered into the workforce, I will say I haven't really experienced much bias, or at least none that truly like pops out to me. I've been so incredibly lucky to have such a supportive team and an incredible manager. And for the construction on my like, career growth, I'm still fairly new, so I haven't felt any construction yet.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. All right, moving on to our gender pay gap issues, right? So there was a study done
Marchie,
by, yes?
just a quick note, there's a number of questions in the chat about the study, and I don't know if you want to get into this many details about it, but
Uh-huh.
you could look at those. I don't know if you want to do that at the end, or maybe just provide a link at some point to the
Yeah, sure.
report or something.
Let's save those for the end, because
Okay.
I do want to give you guys also time as well to speak about your experiences. But I will be happy to drop a link in the chat as well afterwards with that study. Thanks, Susanna. Okay, so going back, so there is this study that was done by the ISC2. Uh, the full name is kind of a mouthful, but I'll give it to you. It's International Information System Security Certification Consortium. So yeah, that's pretty fun to say, I guess. But they did a global workforce survey in cybersecurity, and there were around 15,000 people that took part in that, of which 17% of the respondents were women. And they found that just looking at the US data, the average pay for men and women, the difference was around 5%. And looking at the median salary, a slightly different number, it's 9%. So this is actually way smaller than the global average gender pay gap, which stands at around 20%. So that is really encouraging to see. If we look at the average salary based on ethnicity and gender, you can see that women of color are still being paid significantly less than white men, of course, but also white women. So there's still room for improvement, but it is very exciting to see that it's the percent difference is quite small. And then even looking at the pay gap trends over time, right? So take a look at the millennials earning between 50K and I'm just going to estimate around up to 100K here. Um, this for the females are earning 21% of females are earning this much, right? Compared to 29% of men in that same category. So it's around 8% difference, but take a look at the baby boomers, right? There's 20% difference in the number of men and women that are earning that same amount. And one of the narrowest gaps, which is really exciting to see, is actually men and women in the 100 to 500K category. Women are actually have a 3% lead compared to men in this. So it's really pointing to the fact that, we're making progress in a positive direction. We are reaching pay equity but we still have a little ways to go. So Courtney, I had a question for you. Why do you think we experience a gender pay gap even in cybersecurity? And have you faced known disparities in pay between you and your male peers? And if so, what did you do to resolve the difference?
Yeah, so when I first read this question, I somewhat ignorantly thought I had an answer immediately. And I thought the reason we see this gender pay gap, even in cyber, was for two main reasons. The first is that women are less likely to apply to jobs unless they meet all qualifications. And the second was that women are less likely to negotiate their salary. And the first one comes from a statistic that has been written about by Harvard Business Review, and it's been discussed for years now. And it was actually something my career advisor actually shared with me when I was kind of hesitant to apply for certain jobs because they wanted X number of years of experience or they wanted certain certificates that I just didn't have. And this led me to thinking, like, if it's happening to someone fairly new in cyber, how many other women has this happened to where they might be hesitant to apply for a new role because the position wants 10 plus years of experience, but they have like 8 or 9. And the second reason actually ended up being completely untrue once I actually started doing more research into this. Um, I believe it was late November last year. Released an article, and it found that over the last 2 decades, women are actually more likely than men to ask for more compensation. And it also found that researchers, when they were surveying the public about their beliefs on gender and negotiation, people, myself included, still believe that women were less likely than men to negotiate for better comp. Um, and they found that having this impression that women could earn the same as men simply by negotiating more frequently, it kind of lulls us into this sort of like complacency with the status quo. Um, and after reading that article, um, I realized there is a lot more to this question than I originally anticipated. I started to do more research, and I even asked some of my peers for their insight on why we experience this kind of gap. And it led me to believe that in order for us to kind of even figure out why there's this pay gap, we have to go back to the origin, and that's the history of cyber. And cyber, much like fields like IT and comp sci, these have historically been very male dominated industries. And we've seen this in like movies and TV shows where you have they always portray that cyber professional. It's always a male hacker. It seems like he always has his hoodie on and he's always in the dark. But we've also seen this lack of female role models for young girls to look up into. And with that, it comes these systematic barriers of entry that not only women have to overcome, but they've existed for years. And I think with cybersecurity now being or cybersecurity being portrayed as like kind of like a boys club, um, it can create this unconscious bias that can affect the hiring and promotion and promoting of women, which can lead to this pay discrepancy that we see today. I was actually reading an article. It was by Cyberscoop. It was linked in WESIS's State of Inclusion report, and they were talking about how people unconsciously tend to hire and advance people that have that same background as them. And with that, inevitably comes those pay increases and those pay bumps. But when we think about it, with cyber continuing to grow and positions needing to be filled quickly, you see a lot of people reaching out to their networks and looking for recommendations for people or looking for referrals. But when you have such a heavy male dominated industry, this can kind of unconsciously lead to their network and thus their referrals being male, which can leave women being overlooked. And there was also WESIS's State of Inclusion report also highlighted that women typically hit that glass ceiling 6 to 10 years into their career. And after talking with another one of my coworkers, um, as Rishi previously mentioned, not only is there that gender pay gap, but within that, there's a further gap between white women and women of color. And my coworker let me know that there is actually a difference between how HBCUs and PWIs teach their students about networking. She let me know that HBCUs specifically set the expectations with their students that they're a minority. And in this case, you're a minority in your gender and you're a minority in your race. And they teach them how to navigate these spaces. And with that comes that understanding and the ability to not only recognize the space they're in, but also the inclination to kind of speak up on this topic. And that can translate into the pay differences we see amongst women of color. For example, because um, these HBCUs set these expectations, it can lead to an awareness of these pay gaps and encourage these women to advocate for fair compensation. Whereas PWIs, in my experience, don't really talk about these gaps. And moving on to that last part of the question, personally, I haven't really faced known disparities in pay between me and my male coworkers. Um, as far as I'm aware, I strongly believe that one of the things that really helped me the most was actually my career advisor. She had data. She had data from past graduates that included their employer, their salary, their job titles, and their location, so where they were working. So, although she obviously just did not share the list directly with me for privacy reasons, she was able to provide me with information that included the mean and median for the past 3 years of what most graduates from my program who had a similar background and profile to me were offered. And this allowed for me to negotiate my salary with statistics, and I truly believe that really helped negate any disparities between me and my male peers. Thank you.
They discovered that the number of women in cyber has stayed pretty consistent year to year, at least for the last 5 years. So that number is 20 to 25%. This is way up from 2013 when it was at 10%. So that's really good to see. But if we look at our Fortune 500 companies, right, the number of women that held the Chief Information Security Officer role was just 17%. So there's still a lot of room for improvement there, and I hope that we can get there, within the next decade, but I don't know, we'll see. But what's really encouraging is looking at our small to mid-sized companies. So those ranging from 20 to 10,000 people, there's actually a higher percent of women than men in leadership roles. So for specific facts and statistics, there's actually 11% of women that were reporting to the vice president of IT versus 6% of men. And other facts too, just 19% of women are reporting to IT security directors versus 14% of men in the study. So how can we increase and retain women in cyber? There's a couple things. The first is to focus on the I and DEI. So I think nowadays many organizations understand what diversity and equity means, but we really want to focus on that inclusion factor. I think it's going to help address feelings of not belonging or people feeling like they can't be their authentic selves, and that will definitely help in retaining employees. The next, obviously, is to make pay equity a priority and also address early education. So, studies have found that there's higher rates of women that pursue cybersecurity in school if they have a family member or a mentor working in the field who has encouraged them to pursue it. And we also want to set specific hiring and recruiting metrics. So, 21% of the women in the same study found that the things that motivated them to go to work were a continuously evolving field, and they wanted a field where they could help people and society. So if we tailor our, job postings or the career opportunities provided once you're hired into a company to those two factors, we're really going to help increase, women staying at the company. We're going to increase job satisfaction. And finally, we want to eliminate inequities around advancement. We really need to support women in defining their goals and ensuring that they have equal access to those development opportunities so that they can reach those leadership positions. And I really see that the greater representation of women there are in those senior positions, the more it inspires other women coming up after them to go and do the same, if not reach higher. So, Susanna, I had a question for you. Is there anything that you actively do or think would help to increase the percent of women in the workplace?
So let's see. So as a manager at Sandia, I think one of the things we do and have been doing is we do have a lot of representation of women in management. Our CISO is female. Uh, there's two groups that do mostly cyber work, mine and one other. The other senior manager is also female. And maybe half of the managers working for us are female. And so just having the leadership, both in terms of just representation, but also, as Courtney pointed out, like people are, tend to hire people that they, feel are similar in some way themselves. It's just a kind of a natural human thing. We try to avoid bias, but it kind of evens out that bias to have the hiring managers be diverse themselves. Some of the recruiting that we can do, that we continue to do, is to go to connect with WISIS, and recruit at Grace Hopper and at places like that to try to attract more female cyber people into the workforce. I think those things are all really helpful. Some of the recruiters at Sandia who do that are also male, so it's just an environment that's very supportive of trying to have that diverse kind of workforce. No, that's all sort of limited by how many women have gone into cyber that a place like Sandia can go out and find and try to attract, right? And so some things that are, not in our control, but maybe in control of some of the folks who are part of WASIS is, on the academic side, for example, I think Denise talked about the, coming to cybersecurity later and mid-career and with different strengths and different backgrounds, and really, having the academic leaders encourage that, and not only be looking for people who got into computers, in middle and high school and were already kind of informally learning these things on their own, right? So encouraging people to come to it later, I think that can really help, since there may not be a lot of encouragement earlier for kids coming up, for the girls to be going into things like computers. And a lot of the computer and cyber work that happens before college is pretty self-driven and informal. And so it can also be very much dependent on families having resources to buy computers and encouraging kids to get into that kind of thing. A lot of schools don't have a lot of emphasis, may not even have computer science classes, right? So having that, the colleges and universities encouraging students and trying to attract students into the major and into cybersecurity who have those diverse backgrounds, and then helping them with learning how to network and that kind of thing. So I think it's a two-way street, trying to work from the academic direction upward, and then corporate and other companies who are doing hiring, trying to look to attract those. And then I guess the last thing I mentioned is like mentoring. It's not just about getting into cyber and getting involved and trying to get a job. Once you get there, if you really feel kind of out of depth, or the only one or whatever, that can be really hard. And so I think retention is really important too. So mentoring and having role models and trying to help connect people. Sometimes even across companies, sometimes people will have female cybersecurity experts might have mentors who aren't even at their same company, but still making connections through organizations like WISES and others, to find those mentors. I think that can be really, really important, to have people to talk to and get advice from, et cetera. So I think those are the main things that come to mind.
That's great. Thank you so much, Susanna, for your insight. And finally, the importance of mentorship. So we know, mentoring is important, it helps, but how exactly does it help? And how can we create a healthy mentor-mentee relationship so that both sides are productive and getting the most out of that? So, first thing is that mentoring programs dramatically improve promotion rates for both minorities and women. Actually, mentees and mentors are both promoted 5 times and 6 times, respectively, more than employees without mentors. It, of course, expands your professional network, and it gives you guidance on your work life balance. I think as women, sometimes we struggle with balancing family life and work life. Or even if you don't have a family, you need healthy ways to get away from those work stresses. I know I do. And so it's important to talk to others about this, right? Build a support system around you and get that advice if you're struggling. The other thing that mentoring can help with is enhancing your technical and soft skills. And as we talked about before, increasing your retention and diversity. So, even in those leadership positions, mentoring is going to help you get there and beyond. It also fosters knowledge sharing, and it increases your awareness of career opportunities. So, and one thing I wanted to mention is you can have more than one mentor. I think it's a great thing to have a mentor in different areas of your life. No one person can be the master of all areas. So, it's actually quite interesting, I think, and important to get diverse perspectives on the different things that you want to know about in careers, lives, whatever it is. So, Denise and Susanna, I had a question for both of you. Did either of you ever mentor someone? And what were some of the most useful things that a mentee did for the mentor mentee relationship? And then on the flip side, what things did you do that really benefited your mentee? So, let's start with Denise.
Okay, yeah. And before actually I directly answer that question, I do want to kind of expand on something you were saying there too, and even that Susanna mentioned in terms of kind of where to seek mentors, right? And then for me, when I was in college, there's lots of different groups and clubs and organizations, and that can be sometimes where you get exposed to some of those things. And there was, like ACM and a few, more computer-oriented ones, but I actually got involved a lot with the Society of Women Engineers, which doesn't, it's not a specific computer science or cybersecurity focus. But I found that, even if you're talking to somebody and they're not in your direct computer science, but especially something like different types of engineering that's also a male-dominated field in some ways. Like you can still learn a lot from those people on a lot of the elements that you were just speaking to, right? In terms of work-life balance and soft skills, and even if you're not asking, technical questions or questions per se about that specific career path, that don't feel like you have to limit yourself when you're looking for mentors or looking for organizations to get involved with, to something that is narrow and specific to your field, because some of these organizations also have some broader elements that could touch on that. And then speaking for some of my own mentoring experiences, I think there's a lot of different things that can make a mentorship successful or fail, for that matter. I think one of the key things for as a mentee is to ask questions and ask follow-up questions, right? It's always interesting to see if there's something that is discussed, and then you as a mentee kind of go and think about it some more or research it some more, and come back and ask some of those follow-up questions. I think is always a positive thing, right? And being proactive when you're having especially kind of more formal setup for mentorship. It's something where you're trying to say, okay, we're going to talk every so often or something like that, to try to kind of keep that mentorship healthy. But I think also as a mentee, be proactive to ask questions, right? And it kind of goes back to that. There's no stupid questions, right? Like you're not going to learn and know and grow unless you're open to asking some of the things that are bothering you, even if it might be something that you can say, well, I don't know if they have experience in exactly this, or they've never mentioned struggling with this thing, so they might not be able to help me with it, type of situation. And I think from a mentor perspective, obviously being open and willing to answer a lot of different kinds of questions. But one thing that I think is helpful at times is being able to have make your answers more practical in some way. Well, practical maybe not the right word, but more specific, right? Like when somebody says, I'm interested in cybersecurity, how do I get started? Like on one hand, it's easy to answer and say, well, Google and read some different things, and do some CTFs, or read some reports about attacker TTPs, or whatever kind of general advice you might give. And that's not that that's not helpful, but also if you can point to, here's some specific resources that I find have a certain level of quality or usefulness or real world applicability, I think is a lot easier for people to then be able to dive into looking at good resources and good things that is just a little bit easier than maybe that generic advice of try to follow cyber news, right? Like I've heard that before and things like that. And it's not that it's bad advice, but it's also, if you're new to the area and new to the specialty, then you might not know the best places to look for those things. And that's a place where a mentor can really kind of help point you in the right direction, especially as there's lots of things. Cybersecurity is a space that's had a lot of growth in the last decade or so, in terms of there's lots of cool free resources and things that people can get, but there's also some lower quality things that go out there, and it's like hey, get my certification, take my training course, and you'll be amazing, and you'll have a job in a week, kind of thing, right? And so it can be hard for people, I think, to maybe find a resource that somebody that's already in maybe the position that they want to be in finds useful or worthwhile, right? So I think that that's an important point. And the last thing that I'll end on that I think is important as a mentor is, and really is not just as a mentor, but as a leader, as a peer, is just positive reinforcement, right? It's very easy for people, especially when you're new in your career or you're going through a career change, to focus on the negative and any sort of mistakes or mishaps or things you don't understand. And so I think one of the things to talk about with your mentor and with your mentee is, things that went well, something that you did and you felt like, hey, I got this figured out, or I've been struggling with this problem and I was able to complete it, right? And as a mentor, if you're aware of that, especially if you work closely with someone, maybe you have some of that insight, to be able to reach out and say, hey, this one, the way that you handled this thing was great, or nice work on that. Because I think sometimes we don't always think about how a little bit of that encouragement can go a long way in building people's confidence, and um, that is an important part of as you're building your career, right? You want to feel like you're making headway and you're not stuck on something or struggling with the same thing. Positive reinforcement, I think, is very helpful.
That's great. Thank you, Denise. And Susanna, what about you?
Let's see, there was a lot of good points. Trying to think what I can add to what Denise already shared. I think one thing is that being a mentee, mentor, those kinds of relationships, they really carry through a lot of a career. So just to frame this a little bit, that it's not only about being new in a job and wanting a mentor to help forward your career, that kind of thing. I think that's kind of the model that comes to mind first. But if you're looking to find your first job, having someone that you can talk to do things like look at your resume and look at what jobs you're applying to and give you some advice about places that you might want to apply, and just meeting periodically to talk about your goals and how that's how applications are going. For new people to cyber, obviously in a new role, having a mentor to work with. And I think Denise talked about a lot of the things that can be done to help, like with training and other things to help forward a career. And like for me, when I was going into management, when I was thinking about my first management role in cybersecurity, I had a senior manager who I was talking to, who was mentoring me about the management jobs, right? And now I should be talking to directors. And so, it's something you want to look at through your whole career, that you, whenever possible, want to have at least one mentor, maybe a couple, and be mentoring also. If once you're out of school and have your first job, you're already in a position to be mentoring the people who are still looking, right? So and those relationships can carry through your career. So I think there's a lot of benefit to the mentor-mentee relationship, even beyond those conversations, and advice about good training classes, what certifications are useful or not useful, what employers might be looking for, et cetera. So I think that's all I can think to add. I think but it's a really important thing to just try to maintain through your career, to have those relationships.
That's great. Thanks, Susanna. And I also wanted to say, as a mentee, it's important to come, sort of prepared with your questions. You also don't want to, take advantage of the time that your mentor is giving you. You want to ensure that, okay, you have a goal in mind, present that goal clearly, and, tell them exactly in what capacity that you would like them to mentor you in. Because as soon as you clearly define that, it's a lot easier and a smoother, mentoring relationship that occurs. At least that's been my experience. So thank you both. And finally, I just wanted to give everybody a few women in cyber resources. Some of them I've actually been involved with myself. Others I thought were very interesting that I'm looking forward to looking into. But I want to point out the Women in Cybersecurity Mentor Mentee Program. It's a great initiative by WESIS, and there's a lot of women in there that are looking forward to, mentoring other women that are coming up, or even, peers. It's a great opportunity to figure out, the direction that you want to go in cybersecurity and ask those questions that we were talking about before. There's also a ton of security groups. Some of them meet in person, and I really encourage you to go and meet people face to face. I think, interacting on that level is going to get you comfortable in asking those questions, but also getting more diverse insight from different people than you would just online. And of course, we have conferences. I just put a few, but there's a ton more. WESIS, as you know, has their own conference. There's the Diana Initiative. And then there's a lot of other things, online. There's podcasts, there's YouTube channels. If you don't know how to get into the field of cybersecurity, these are really helpful. If you are in the field of cybersecurity, but you want to transition into a new role, these are also super helpful. So I really encourage you to take a look at those. And then finally, Under the additional resources, I would like to point out the Code Like a Girl. It's a great organization that I have been lucky to have the chance to volunteer for. And it's really inspiring to see a lot of younger kids wanting to go into this field and also with cyber. So, yeah, that is our presentation for today. I did want to thank our panelists for being here and doing such an amazing job of sharing their experiences. So if anybody has questions, please type it into the chat and we will be happy to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruchi, and everyone on the panel, Denise, Susanna, and Courtney. It was just spectacular to hear about a topic that is very close to Weeks's heart. The State of Inclusion Benchmark Report is obviously something we were very excited to conduct, and to hear strategic partners' opinions and people in the field's opinions on the study always is nice feedback, and it's nice to see that the research is going in the right direction. But we do have a lot of questions, and we are limited on time, so I want to get going. The first one that I'd love to just get started with is this individual has several years of general business experience, but they're new to the field of cybersecurity. And they're having a challenging time to secure interviews. Despite holding a master's in information technology with a focus on cybersecurity, along with holding numerous certifications, they encounter different obstacles due to the preference of candidates with extensive experience in cybersecurity. How do they get that first job in cyber? Like, how do they get the foot in the door? What advice do you have for this individual?
Susanna, Denise, Courtney, do you guys want to go first?
Courtney, do you want to comment since you've just gone through this yourself recently, more recently than I have anyway?
Yeah. So I have been in cyber so I transitioned to cyber in 2021. So I'm about 3 years now into cyber. And I I would say for me it helped a lot reaching out to my network. So I reached out to so I was in school, which may be a little bit different, but I was able to reach out to like alumni. That's how I got a lot of my interviews. And I also found that applying to smaller companies just to get your foot in the door can really help. That's what quite a few of like my peers did in school is I did like local. So I went to school in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So they looked for like sa- so they looked for smaller tech companies in Pittsburgh where they could get their foot in the door, they could get experience, and then from there that's when you now that you have that on your resume, you can then start going to different like career fairs and different reaching you're growing your network, and you can start continuously um, moving up to the companies that you would love to work with. I actually found Sandia at a career fair. I talked with the recruiter and she said, "What do you study?" And I said, "Cybersecurity." And she threw like 10 jobs at me. And she's like, "Apply to these." Um, and ended up getting interviewed. And that's how I ended up meeting my now manager. I would also say going to conferences and help and doing that in-person networking. I've gotten quite a few interviews as well when I was at WESIS conference. Getting a lot of the companies will do like I think it's like 15-20 minute like technical interviews. I think I've done a couple in like the defense industry. Um, so I hope that was helpful.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question before we move to the next? Okay. I'm going to answer this one. I'm going to address this one quickly. Ruchi, is it going to be possible that we share the slides, even if it's just the last slide with the resources? Because I've seen a few of those questions and I want to make sure I get that one answered.
Yes, definitely. They are free for public use.
Okay, perfect. So, viewers, I will make sure I get those attached shortly after the webinar has completed to this webinar. So you'll see it in the attachment section. Thank you, Ruchi, for that question. And then another question was, what is the path to getting, we sort of covered this. What is the path to getting a cybersecurity position? Are there certain certificates that you find are needed for a cybersecurity position? Yeah, we'll leave it at that.
I can
Go
go
ahead,
ahead,
Ruchi.
Denise.
Okay. I'll take a stab at this, and then others can chime in. But I think, and hopefully, you guys see that just with our panel here, right, is that there are lots of paths to get into cybersecurity, right? And I mean, it can be it can be a tough field to get into as well. With, as we saw with our previous question of, it is a field where they're often looking for experience. But I thought Courtney had some great advice there. But I think, that is one thing to remember, that cybersecurity is a place that you can, that doesn't mean that that's what you knew you wanted to do since you were 5 years old, or that you even went to school for, right? There are lots of different ways, and some of that can be training and certifications. It can be, there's also, a lot that you can do, just kind of learning on your own, and playing with stuff, and going through, different, like, online challenges, or, run a packet capture on your own network, see what it looks like, right? I mean, there's lots of things that you can do, I think, too, to kind of help get more familiar with some of the tools and the capabilities, and things that are out there that can try to help you understand exactly what you want to focus on in cybersecurity, which can also help you figure out what jobs you want to go for, and ways that can, help set you apart as well. I think, getting a job, there's a lot of challenge in those first steps of what does your resume look like, in your education and your certifications, and that's, got a lot of automated processes and a lot of things that can cause hiccups. But I think once you get to the point where you are, like, at an interview stage and talking about some of your experience, right? Not everything has to be your work or your education experience either, right? You can talk about stuff that you do on the weekends, stuff that you do in your free time, that are teaching you skills that maybe, are not exactly the same as what you're getting from a job experience or an educational experience, but can really bring a lot of benefit to those roles. And I think that that's an important thing as well, to try to look for some of those, opportunities.
Ruchi, do you want to add in?
Yeah, so I agree with everything Denise is saying. The other thing, at least in my experience, is that once you have a few years of work experience in cyber, I think employers tend to understand the things that you know. And so those certifications may or may not be as important anymore. Um, if it's your first job, they do help you get a leg up, but I don't think it's the end of the world if you don't have certifications.
Awesome. Thank you guys for that. I really liked this question, and I think you will be able to provide some insight. Do you have any advice, besides from getting a mentor, for those who struggle with imposter syndrome? I feel like I hear a lot of women, when they get these roles, that is a big a struggle a lot of us have. And especially from being a minority group and an early graduate is another addition to that question.
So I can start. I think imposter syndrome is a very big thing. I struggle with it myself, and I know a lot of my peers and women, in the industry struggle with it. For me, it's always good to just be open about it. I think, yes, getting over that barrier is going to be a bit of a challenge, but once you do, it really creates a very honest conversation that you can have with those mentors or even your peers that, I'm struggling with this, and do you have advice? I've done this myself. I said, I don't feel that I'm very smart or capable of doing this. And I've had my peers come tell me that we all struggle with it. So don't worry about it. And these are people that have been, working in that position for, 5 to 8 years. They're experienced hires, but they also struggle with it. So I would say it's like ripping the Band-Aid off. So yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add, kind of, or pile on to the same thing. It's just incredibly common. So one of the things that helps people, I think, to some degree, deal with imposter syndrome is just realizing I'm not alone. Like many people I know, whether they admit it or not, are feeling that, right? And then, as Ruchi said, having talking to people you trust about it and getting their advice, and that can be people inside or outside of the field. I think somewhere there was another question about mentors and whether it's useful to have people in or outside of cybersecurity. I think Denise already mentioned like going to women, to engineers generally, like females in other engineering roles, or supportive men in cybersecurity roles, or mentors can be all kinds of people. It's really developing a trusted relationship where you could talk about things like this with them. And so you want a mentoring relationship, or your manager at work, or these other your colleagues, to be people that you can talk to about it. And I think Ruchi's right that people generally are very supportive. If you're talking to your coworkers about it and they're not supportive, you may not really love continuing to work there for a long time. Like, you might want to be looking, because it's not a great, so you want your work environment to be supportive, right? And your manager to be supportive. There's nothing more important. And then the technical stuff you learn and you can do really well. But if you're not able to talk to the people you're working with, that's not a fun day. So encourage people to be looking for those employment not just for the technical, but for the work environment that supports working through that stuff.
Yeah. Thank you. So we are past time, and I just wanted to highlight a couple of things because there are a lot of questions that we did not get time to. One, Ruchi, you mentioned the Luisa's mentorship program. It is a program that we run once a year and unfortunately closed at the end of July, but please subscribe to the newsletter. We'll do the advertising for it for next summer. And then the other is how important allies are. I just thought that was a key thing. Finding those male allies in the industry, I think, is very helpful. And in any industry, allies in general, they play an important part in ensuring that we all have the same voice that we need. But we are at time. I want to say thank you so much to Ruchi, Denise, Susanna, and Courtney. I will be attaching the slides, and I hope everybody has a spectacular rest of the day. And thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.